Hello everyone, I'm LazyGrouse, and today we're taking a look at OvN Lost faction's Fimir. And the Fimir is the weird one-eyed hunchback swamp monsters that you might know from Norscan's roster. But the OvN team gave them their own faction with a full custom roster ranging from Fimir and Boglars to awesome swamp monsters and weird demons. Because the Fimir are chaos worshippers. But they lost the favor of the gods and got pushed to the side when the chaos gods got more interested in the humans. So their campaigns are very centered on their religions, but their religion is very different between sub-factions, so depending on which one you choose, the campaign is gonna play very differently, and you'll see why soon enough. But they are of course still the same race, so they do share a lot of mechanics, and the main campaign mechanic of the faction is their slaves. But they're not like the Dark Elf slaves, because they don't impact your economy on the same level as with the Dark Elves. But these slaves aren't for you. They're here to be sacrificed for the glory of the Chaos Gods. And there are a couple of buildings that sacrifice or capture slaves over time, and some that depend on the number of slaves that you do have to generate a bonus for you. But it's not very hard to maintain those levels because they don't deplete naturally by themselves. You gotta spend them, and that's where the sub-factions differ, because they both have their own method of sacrificing slaves, and that's where most of your slaves are gonna be sacrificed. But we'll see how and why when we take a closer look at the two sub-factions. The rest of their buildings are pretty standard control, economy and garrison buildings, and of course recruitment buildings that might give some small bonuses along with the units you unlock. There's also a couple of other ways of spending slaves. You can sacrifice some slaves before battle to gain spell mastery, which can turn the tide in a difficult battle because it can go up to 100%, which is incredibly strong, but it'll cost you a lot of slaves. And you can also use slave rituals, which will give you campaign movement range, ambush chance, vanguard and slows down enemies in the area for 500 slaves, or you can get growth and cheaper buildings for 400 slaves. So that's a bunch of ways to use slaves. And getting the slaves is pretty straightforward since you just have to fight battles for them, because your options after a land battle is to enslave captives, which gives you replenishment and slaves, while the other two options gives you experience and money. And your options after a settlement battle are enshroud, which gives you money replenishment and slaves, you can raid, which gives you money replenishment, slaves and gifts of the dark gods, which gives your entire army leadership and regeneration, and obliterate, which raises the settlement and only gives you money and gifts of the dark gods. The faction also has a full custom tech tree that is mostly the same in both sub-factions, with just one tech being unique to each of them, and one of the capstone tech gives some extra goodies to the rank or hold faction. But besides that, the top two lines gives general campaign map bonuses like growth, money, campaign movement range, replenishment, control and slaves. The third line gives combat bonuses to your Fimir infantry, from low tier Fimir to your big monsters infantry Fimir. The fourth line has a mix of caster stuff, campaign bonuses and army bonuses, with Winds of Magic reserves, some bonuses for Balefiend units and characters, movement range and ambush chance, spell resistance, but most importantly, this is how you unlock their army abilities, which we'll take a closer look at when we check out their armies. And the fifth line gives you combat bonuses to the rest of your units, like swamp monsters and demons. And the final line is blessings from each of the 4 chaos gods that will give you bonuses that's in flavor with each of the gods, as well as one of the tech that's different between the factions. And once you've researched all of them, there's a capstone tech that will give all your units rage, along with some other bonuses with some extra goodies sprinkled in for rank or hold. There's also some capstone technologies at the far end of the tree that will give you some more substantial bonuses to your faction. The faction also have some built-in defensive abilities, because all their settlements gets an effect over the region called Swirling Mists, which gives friendly movement range, hero action success chance, ambush chance, and gives enemy armies lower movement and lower leadership. Their settlements are also hidden like Skaven settlements, so they look like ruins for enemies. And all the Fimir factions are also kinda connected to each other, because every time a Fimir faction is destroyed, those Fimir take on a death quest, and all Fimir factions get access to Fimir death quest units. But a faction doesn't have to die to get Fimir death quest. You also get Fimir death quest if you lose a settlement, or a lord is defeated in battle with heavy losses. But in those cases, only that faction gains the death quest units. And that's all the basic mechanics of the Fimir faction, so let's take a look at the sub-factions and why they are so different. So they got 2 legendary lords you can play as. First, we got Katash, the leader of Rank or Hold, which starts their campaign in the northwest part of the Empire in Wrecker's Point. Their faction is all about the Chaos Gods, and their campaign is very focused on getting their favor. So their faction mechanic is borrowed from the Warriors of Chaos, because they got the Gifts of Chaos mechanic, which is also where they spend their slaves. And like the Warriors of Chaos mechanic, the more slaves they sacrifice to the Chaos Gods, the bigger reward they can get from their sacrifices. This way they can also access demon units, and once they sacrifice enough slaves, the eyes of the gods will open and they will get a choice of a reward. So the faction will play pretty similarly to the Warriors of Chaos, in that you want to play very aggressively to generate as many slaves as possible, to continuously sacrifice more and more slaves for greater gifts, and to get the eye of the gods to open. But their faction effect will help them out with this, because they get more slaves captured after battles, as well as recruit rank for Fimir Balefiends. Mir's Katash herself is a very powerful caster lord, and with her items, abilities and magic, she can decimate enemy armies while also buffing her own units. Her lord effect lowers upkeep for elite Fimir infantry and gives them magic resistance, and she also got some replenishment for good measure. She also got a very strong mix of spells from various chaos schools and the dark school of magic, with blue fire, power of darkness, hysterical frenzy, blade wind, stream of corruption and pink fire. At rank 8 she gets her unique skill line, which gives her more money from sacking and control, buffs to Fianna Fame units, poison mist, which will deal damage and lower leadership around her with increasing effect the longer she stays in melee combat, megalomaniacal spellcasting, which increases spell mastery the longer she stays in melee combat or casts spells. She also gets spell cooldown, more reserves, and a buff to Balefiend apprentices, and finally a buff to a bunch of their demons and a swamp demon summon. She also gets 2 magical items, which she gets at level 11 and 13 with Staff of Balor's Eyes, which gives her corruption, magic attack, although she already had that, AP damage, lower miscast chance and a bound vortex spell, and the Crown of Hellmother gives more winds increase, magic resistance and ward save. And at level 12 she gets her Throne of the Hellmother, which is an awesome palanquin mount, which makes her a little bit more tanky so she can sit in melee and charge her abilities, and it gives her the abilities Crush Our Foes and Protect the Throne, which gives all allies in range a big offensive and defensive buff respectively. So with the throne, her abilities and her spell selection, she really just wanna sit in the middle of a blob of friendly and enemy units to buff her units while debuffing enemies, all the while becoming better and better at casting the longer she sits there. And then we have Kroll, the leader of the Tenders of Doom, and they start in the jungle of Bahuax in the Monument of the Moon, and this faction doesn't really worship the main Chaos Gods, because Kroll herself is a demon prince, and she's trying to become a Chaos God herself. A very original thing for a demon prince to do, I know. So instead, Kroll is their god, and their faction mechanic is all about her ascension to godhood. So in order for Kroll to ascend, you have to build temples to Kroll in capital settlements, and the more temples you build, the more powerful Kroll will grow. So each temple will increase Kroll's mass, armor and weapon strength, along with some bonuses to Kroll's entire army and some diplomatic bonuses. The temples will also spread corruption, give you cheaper and higher recruitment rank, and unlock recruitment of the bog octopus. The temples will cost you 15 slaves per turn, so early in the game keeping your slave count high will be pretty easy, but the more temples you have, the more slaves will be sacrificed each turn to the glory of Kroll. Her faction effect makes sea lane travel faster, lower upkeep for Bog Octopus, Fog Shrines of Balor and Demonomaniacs, gives her extra growth, more replenishment and immunity to a bunch of different sea attritions. Her lord effect is the Allmother, and it further lowers the upkeep for Bog Octopi, a big melee attack bonus while out at sea, a leadership debuff to enemies in the region, and missile resistance to demons and some swamp monsters. Her spells are a mix of Lore of the Deep and Death, which fits her very well. She's got Spirit Leech, Tide Call, Soul Blight, Fog of the Damned, Kraken's Pull, because of course, and Purple Sun. Her unique skill line gives her Mother of 1,000 Young, which gives her some regeneration and power recharge depending on how many enemies around her is wavering or lower leadership. She also gets some bonuses to her stats. She gets Constrict on Contact Effect, which does damage over time, combat bonuses for Bog Octopi, demons and other swamp monsters, and she also gets Broodmother, which is an ability that when an enemy unit is at very low HP, it will take huge damage and summon a Bog Octopus hatchling. So she basically plants an octopus egg in an enemy and it just bursts out at low HP. So kinda like Morger's Chaos Spawn effect. And then finally, she also gets immunity to contact effects, fast wound recovery, and Fulcrum of Worship, which gives her and the allies in range more damage, spell resistance, and leadership the more units die around her. So basically, Kroll is a strong caster with a very fitting set of spells, good abilities, and a terrifying fighter since she is a huge octopus monster that gets stronger through her faction mechanic. She unfortunately doesn't have any magical items, and of course no mount, because again, giant octopus monster, but she'll do just fine without them. But I think that's all there is to their campaign, so let's take a look at their army roster. And like the demonic chaos factions, they get army abilities during combat, which becomes available by killing enemies. Pretty straightforward. The first ability is Cursed Mist, which will lower range, speed, charge speed, and greatly deplete ammunition of an enemy unit. And this can be really effective if you need to catch up to a unit or neutralize a ranged unit. And this is wherever on the map, so if you're having problem with some artillery, for example, just use this on it and it will run out of ammo real fast. The second ability is Fog of Fimble, which will increase the speed of units in an area and give them snipe, stalk and unspottable, so you basically shroud them in magic mist so the enemy can't find them and you can just go and sneak up on whatever you want, or you can just use it to get away from something. And the third ability is Creatures of the Bog, and it summons a unit of feral bog beasts, which is a unit of huge freaky frog lizards, and they got pretty good stats with really good damage and poison on contact, so you can just drop this on some backline units and they will rip through them in no time. And they're really fast, so they can just charge from unit unit to unit and really devastate that backline. Or you could just use them to help out your front line and do some real damage with some big rear charges. But that's their army abilities, so let's take a look at their units. And we've already looked at their legendary lords, so they also got 2 generic lords. The Fimir Noble is their melee combat lord, and he's got pretty good stats with armor sundering, magic attacks and good AP, so he's really good at taking down armored targets, and his heavy armor and good defense makes him pretty tanky, and he gets a bog beast mount. He also have the ability Mystic Mist, which gives missile resistance and stalk to all allies in range, while his leadership is higher than 50% and isn't fighting. So you can use him to give a couple of units stealth and have him lead a stealth party and sneak around the enemy army. He also have From the Mist, which is an ability that all units of Fimir have, which gives them missile resistance as long as their leadership is over 50%. They also have the Dirac Elder, which is their caster lord, and they're basically Fimir Balefiend that you can use as a lord, and they come with Fire, Beast, Death and Shadow. They also got the Finmore, which is their close combat hero character, and just like the Noble, they're very good melee characters with heavy armor, good stats, good damage, and with armor sundering and magic attacks. They also have a pretty decent bonus versus infantry, so they're very good at dueling footlords or just sending them into infantry. They also have the Boglar Shaman, and I absolutely love their model. It's a little swamp Nobbler caster character, and it looks like his mushroom wizard hat is growing right from his head. And they fittingly got a mix of spells from the Goblin's Little While lore and the Lore of the Deep, with Sneaky Stabbin', Itchy Nuisance, Curse of the Bad Moon, Tidecall, Fog of the Damned, and Kraken's Pull. He's not very good in combat though, but I like his mix of spells, and you can put him on a Moorhound, which will triple his speed, so he can just ride around and drop spells everywhere. They also have the Fimir Balefiend of course, and they're the same as the Norscan roster with Lore of Fire, Beast, Death and Shadow. And that's all of their characters, so let's take a look at their infantry. And their chef units are of course Boglars, which is a very aquatic looking Noblar, but weirdly enough they aren't aquatic. They're kinda just blue Noblars. They got the same stats as normal Noblars and they fill the same role of just being meat shields, but they look pretty neat. Next we got the Sherrills, and they're basically the lowest tier of Fimir, and they're pretty basic early game infantry unit with expendable. They also have the Sherrill Scout, which is a javelin variant, which is one of the very few range units in the roster, and they deal really good damage. And they're especially good at hitting large stuff even without depth perception, because they got a big anti-large, so big stuff will go down fast. But since it's javelins, they don't have the greatest range on their attacks. Then we have the Fim Warriors, which is their more elite infantry, and they got pretty good stats and health, but they aren't that heavily armored and don't have the greatest damage, but they will perform pretty well in close combat and they're great support for their big heavy hitting stuff. And they come with sword and board and great weapons. They also got a Regiment of Renown, and they got a pretty decent stat boost compared to normal Fim Warriors, but more importantly, they got a short ranged axe throwing attack that deals really good AP damage and shield breaker. Then we got the Swamp Demons, and they're much more fragile than the Fim Warriors, but they're heavily invested in damage instead with low defense but very good damage, and they got Vanguard and Stalk, so they're really good at sneaking around the enemy to hit their back line. They also got Fimir Death Quest, but they're only available through the Death Quest mechanic, and they're basically Fimir Flagellants because they got pretty high attack and damage with Frenzy and Unbreakable, so they will stand and fight until they die, but they also got very low armor and defense, so they will take a lot of damage even if they win. There's also a Fim Death Quest Regiment of Renown that's pretty much the same thing but with Death Blow. So next up we got their cavalry, and there isn't a lot of them, but what they have is pretty good. So first we got the Knucklevies, and these are some of my favorite models of the faction because they're weird flesh demons on mounts, but the rider is growing out of the back of the horse, so I think it's just one entity and it looks awesome. And they're a really good cav unit with stats on par with questing knights, but much squishier, so you can't really leave them in combat for too long, but they deal fire and magic damage, so they can annihilate some units on a good charge. They also got the Bog Beast Raiders, which is a monstrous cavalry unit that looks absolutely amazing and also one of my favorite models in the faction, and they got decent stats with high damage and good charge bonus and a really high mass, so they can do some really heavy impact damage on a charge. They're also surprisingly fast considering how they look. They also have a Regiment of Renown variant that is a Bog Beast Raider unit with slightly better stats and the ability Gloomflies, which gives them terror and defense while they're fighting. And now we're getting to the main part of the Fimir faction, their monsters. And first we got the Moorhounds, and they're pretty standard hound units. They're very fast and good at getting into soft squishy backline units like archers or artillery, and they're amazing at chasing routing units off the map. But like other hounds, you don't want to get them into sustained combat with competent fighters because they don't really have the best of stats. They also have a large Regiment of Renown variant, and they're much better in sustained combat because they got a big stat boost compared to their normal variant, and they also cost terror, so they're great for terror routing things. You just have the rear charge units with them because with the leadership penalty from the rear charge and fear, things become very easy to terror route. They also got Chaos Furies, which as usual are really squishy, but they're great at diving backline units. And then we get to the big Fimir units with Fim Mistmore, and they're a big corrupted looking Fimir that can dish out great AP damage with good offensive stats, but compared to the other monster sized Fimir, they're more offense than defense, so if you want damage, these guys are great at taking down armored units, but if you want a more defensive unit, then the next one is better. Because next we have the Fianna Fim, and they're the more tanky Fimir with heavy armor and good defensive stats, so they're much harder to take down. But they also deal a little bit less damage, but with magic attacks and good AP, they still do some decent damage. And since they sunder armor, they also help other units do more damage. And the basic variants come with dual weapons, but they can also use great weapons for bonus versus large and a bit more offense. They also got a Regiment of Renown that is a shielded Fianna Fim unit with frostbite and better stats. Next we got the Fen Beast, and if you've played OVN's other faction, Albion, then you recognize these guys. They're very tanky thanks to their large health pool, good defensive stats and regeneration, which counteracts their lowish armor. But they don't have the greatest leadership though, and as constructs, they will crumble pretty fast if they break, but magic dependent will buff their leadership if you can keep your wins over 15. And then we got the Bog Octopus, which is just a giant octopus, and it's a great anti-infantry monster that you can just throw into blobs of infantry and it'll do great damage. It doesn't have the greatest defensive stats, but it's got a large health pool so it can take quite a beating before it dies. And their last big melee combat monster is their Demonomaniac, and it's a huge anti-large monster very similar to a Bloodthirster, but not quite as deadly, but then again what is. It's still got very good offensive stats with good AP and bonus versus large, and it's tankier than a Bloodthirster with a larger health pool and regeneration, so this guy can keep going in a long fight. It also got a Regiment of Renown, but it's basically a variant with better stats. They also have 2 more ranged units, with the first one being the Belfiend Apprentices, and they're a unit of spellcasters that can shoot devastating volleys of magic missiles that can absolutely decimate anything it shoots at, whether it's infantry or large units with or without armor, but they're a bit finicky to use because they're easily obstructed since they have no arc on their shots, but they can also function a bit as a support unit because they have a Bound Spirit Leech and Curse of Andrahir, so they can deal some direct damage and debuff the enemy. And the final unit is the Bog Shrine of Balor, and it's a magic artillery chariot and it can deal some really good damage at long range, but it shoots very slowly with 1 shot every 22 seconds. But it also buffs units around it, so while it isn't shooting, it can just roll around your units with favor of Balor for some immune psychology and leadership, and give her a Shrouded Glory for missile resistance that increases the more units die within range. And that's all of their units. And they feel like they fit in with the other Chaos factions because they're fairly similar to, for example, the Beastmen, because they don't have a lot of ranged units and rely heavily on their monsters to get up and personal with the enemy. But even though they're similar to the Beastmen, they still have their unique flair and feel, so it's not just more of the same. And I really enjoyed this faction, so I can recommend that you try it out if you think it looks interesting, and I leave a link to the mod page in the description, and I also have a Kroll campaign on my channel if you want to see how they play in action. But that's gonna be it for me this time. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video and want more, leave a like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!